The next few days were strangely quiet. Caleb was still the same, focused, reserved, yet there was an undercurrent to his actions, a subtle shift in the way he interacted with me. We both avoided the topic of that conversation, but the air between us felt charged. I could feel the weight of it every time our eyes met, every time he smiled just a little too long. It was only when Evan had to stay with his grandmother for the weekend that things finally came to a head. Caleb invited me to stay for dinner, and though the invitation seemed casual, I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was happening beneath the surface. We ate in the dining room, the table lit by a single candle in the center, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost intimate, but still laced with the tension of unspoken words. After the meal, Caleb offered me a drink. I accepted, and we sat down together in the living room, the space between us both comfortable and fraught with the weight of everything that had passed between us. Caleb finally broke the silence, his voice quieter than usual. "You're probably wondering why I brought you here tonight." I looked at him, trying to read his expression. "Honestly, I'm not sure." He chuckled softly, but it was a nervous sound, not one I'd heard from him before. "I'm not great at this, at opening up, but I want you to know that I respect you. I respect what you're doing here." I nodded, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "I appreciate that, Caleb." He took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "But I also want to be clear. I don't expect anything from you. Not anything that you don't want. I needed you to know how I feel, because I can't keep pretending." The room seemed to shrink, the space between us charged with emotion. I could feel it, his words, his intentions, and the subtle pull between us. But there was no easy way to respond. I wasn't sure where this was going, but in that moment, I knew I couldn't turn away. We had crossed a line, and I didn't know how far it would take us. But for the first time in a long while, I felt something real stir within me, something I couldn't ignore. The following week passed in a quiet haze. Caleb's house, once a place of routine and predictable interactions, had transformed into a landscape of unspoken emotions, every glance between us heavy with meaning. I couldn't help but replay the conversations we'd had, the moments of silence that now seemed laden with something deeper. I was walking a fine line, caught between the comfort of familiarity and the pull of something new and unsettling. That Friday, after Evan had been dropped off at his grandmother's for the weekend, Caleb texted me asking if I could stay the night again to help with some tasks. It seemed like a harmless request, an extension of our regular arrangement, but the tone of his message felt different. There was a certain weight to it, a quiet urgency that I couldn't ignore. My heart thudded in my chest as I responded with a simple "sure, I'll be there around 6. I tried to push the unease aside as I made my way to the Whitman house. The evening was cooler than usual, and the air felt thick with anticipation. I arrived on time, to find Caleb already waiting for me at the door. His usual composed expression was replaced by something more complicated. Tired, perhaps, but with a flicker of something else that was harder to place. "Hey, Noah," Caleb greeted me, his voice softer than usual. He stepped aside to let me in, his movements uncharacteristically hesitant. "Hey," I replied, stepping inside and instantly feeling the shift in the air. "Everything okay?" Caleb nodded, but didn't immediately answer. Instead, he led me into the living room, where a bottle of wine and 2 glasses sat on the coffee table. The room was lit by the soft glow of a few strategically placed lamps, casting a warm, intimate light across the space. "I thought we could relax a bit," Caleb said, his eyes not quite meeting mine. He poured the wine, his hands steady, but there was a slight tremor in his movements, something that told me this evening wasn't going to be like any of our previous encounters. I sat down, taking a deep breath as I tried to steady my own racing pulse. "Sounds good," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral, but I could feel the tension between us, thick and unyielding. He handed me a glass and then sat beside me, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than usual. "I've been thinking," he began slowly, "about what we talked about last time. And I just want you to know that I'm not looking for any kind of pressure. I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything." I nodded, but the words caught in my throat. "You don't have to apologize," I said. It's complicated. I'm not sure what I feel, Caleb. I don't know how to process all of this." Caleb sighed, setting his glass down on the table and leaning back. "Yeah, I get it. This isn't easy. I know I've probably made you uncomfortable. That's the last thing I want to do." I watched him carefully, noticing the vulnerability in his posture, the slight tension in his jaw. He was trying to stay composed, but there was something raw about him that I hadn't seen before. It made my chest tighten, a knot forming in my stomach as I realized how deeply conflicted he was. "Why don't we take this slow?" I suggested, my voice quieter than I intended. "I mean, we don't have to have everything figured out right now." Caleb's eyes softened at my words, his gaze shifting to the floor for a moment, as if he was trying to gather himself. When he looked back up at me, there was a flicker of something between us, something I wasn't sure how to label, but it was there, undeniable and electric. "I want to take it slow," he murmured, "but I also don't want to keep pretending like this doesn't matter. Like what's between us is just nothing." There it was again, the unspoken truth hanging between us, undeniable but still unacknowledged. My mind raced, trying to process the weight of his words. Was he saying he felt the same pull I did? That this thing, whatever it was, had grown beyond the boundaries we'd set? The silence stretched on for a moment, both of us uncertain of where to go next. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the fluttering in my chest. "We don't have to figure everything out tonight," I repeated, this time more firmly, "but we can talk and see where it goes." Caleb nodded, his lips curling into a small, almost relieved smile. He reached for his glass again, taking a slow sip, and I did the same. The quiet between us was no longer awkward but comfortable, like we had both finally acknowledged something neither of us had been ready to confront. As the evening wore on, we talked, really talked, for the first time. The conversation was deep, introspective, and personal. We shared stories from our past, the things that shaped us, the fears we'd carried for years. Caleb spoke about his childhood, about growing up in a conservative family and the pressure of always having to be perfect, to fit into a mold that never quite suited him. I spoke about my own struggles, my hesitation to step into the world as who I truly was, the constant fear of rejection. The more we talked, the more I realized how much we had in common, how much we were alike, despite the different paths we'd taken in life. The evening grew late, and the conversation turned softer, more intimate, but without any sense of urgency. It felt like we were building something together, brick by brick, without the need for immediate answers. Caleb, more relaxed now, leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know this is complicated, but I also know that I don't want to ignore it anymore. I don't want to keep pretending like there's nothing between us." I felt my breath catch at his words, the weight of them settling on my chest. It was a confession, not just of feelings, but of something deeper. An acknowledgement that this wasn't just a passing moment, but something that had the potential to grow into something far more meaningful. I swallowed, my throat dry. "What do we do now?" I asked, unsure of what the next step was, but also strangely certain that there was no turning back from here. Caleb's hand brushed against mine, his touch gentle but deliberate. "We take it one step at a time," he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. "But we don't have to do it alone." There was a warmth in his words, in the simple gesture of his hand resting beside mine, that made me believe in the possibility of something more, something real. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future where Caleb and I weren't just employer and employee, but something more. A future where we could explore the complexities of our feelings without fear or shame. The next few weeks passed in a blur of quiet moments shared between us. Caleb and I moved cautiously, as if walking on fragile ground. The boundaries we had once carefully crafted were slowly dissolving, replaced by something far more intimate. Yet, we never rushed. There was a careful tenderness to everything we did. The way we touched, the way our conversations deepened, the way our glances lingered a little longer than before. We found ourselves together more often. Whether it was working late on projects around the house or sitting together in the evenings, our connection grew. And with it came a new understanding of the emotions we both held. Emotions that couldn't be ignored any longer. One evening, as we sat on the couch after dinner, Caleb leaned over, his lips brushing against my ear. It was an innocent gesture, or so I thought at first. But when he pulled away, there was a glimmer in his eyes that sent a jolt through my body. His fingers lingered on my shoulder, his touch sending sparks across my skin. "You're not afraid of this, are you?" he whispered, his voice soft, almost teasing. I turned to look at him, my heart racing. The question was simple, but the implications were anything but. The air between us had shifted again, and this time, the tension felt more palpable, more undeniable. "I'm not afraid," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know where it'll take us." Caleb smiled, his eyes never leaving mine. "Neither do I. But maybe that's the best part." I felt his hand on my cheek then, his fingers gently brushing my skin as he leaned in. The distance between us closed, and for the first time in weeks, there was no hesitation, no second-guessing. His lips met mine, soft at first, testing the waters. The kiss was gentle, explorative, as if we were both trying to understand the emotions that had been building between us. The world outside the house faded away, leaving only Caleb and me, two people who had crossed a line and weren't looking back.